Well, first of all, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's annual Washington Forum. My name is Cliff May. I'm the president of FDD. As I think you know, our theme this year is the Middle East in transition, allies, adversaries, and enemies. I'm reminded that less than a generation after World War II, in the midst of a Cold War whose outcome we don't always remember was in doubt, we didn't know how that would come out, John F. Kennedy famously proclaimed that Americans would support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. And more than a half century later, in an era fraught with conflict and tension, it may be time to ask, is that still America's credo? In particular, are Americans still committed to liberty in the sense that John Kennedy meant it? Or does that word now sound old-fangled somehow? And can our friends still rely upon our support, even when the going gets tough? And do our foes still have reason to fear us? And those nations that profess friendship but seek to ingratiate themselves with our foes, what are we to do about them? For example, Pakistan, a place I've been many times, a place where I have good friends. Nonetheless, I think you have to say it is, at best, America's least reliable ally. Since becoming nuclear armed in 1998, it has been responsible for the proliferation of nuclear technology to any number of rogue regimes. Within the country's powerful military and intelligence services, we know there are influential individuals whose sympathies lie with the Taliban and with al-Qaeda. And does anyone seriously believe that no senior Pakistani officials knew that Osama bin Laden, along with 3 of his wives and a passel of his children, had taken up housekeeping in the hill resort of Abbottabad, not far from the Pakistani capital of Islamabad? Not long ago, the Republic of Turkey was regarded as the most Western of Muslim-majority nations, a proud member of the NATO alliance. But since Erdogan, the leader of the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, was elected prime minister in 2003, Turkish nationalism has taken on an increasingly Islamist and autocratic coloration. Erdogan has not contributed to Western efforts to use economic pressure to prevent Iran's terrorist sponsoring and global revolutionary regime from obtaining a nuclear weapons capability. And Erdogan has openly expressed the striking view that democracy is like a streetcar. When you get to your stop, you get off. The reset with Russia was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It hasn't quite worked out that way. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has spent untold billions of petrodollars spreading a fundamentalist and bellicose interpretation of Islam around the world. At the same time, the Saudis are pragmatic enough to recognize that they face a serious strategic threat from Iran, whose rulers disdain monarchical rule in favor of velayat-i-faqih, the guardianship of jurists, meaning mullahs, who interpret Islamic law and combine religious and political power. The state of Qatar hosts America's most important military base in the Middle East, as well as a number of campuses affiliated with American universities and think tanks. And Qatar also funds Al Jazeera, the popular Arabic television channel that promotes anti-Americanism, blood libels against Israelis and Jews, and outrageous conspiracy theories. America's list of what might be called frenemies also includes Egypt, which was not allied with the U.S. during the short time it was under Muslim Brotherhood rule, nor can its current military rulers be seen as allies, not when it comes to such questions as human rights, though they are among the few Muslim rulers today seriously fighting Islamism and jihadism, particularly in the Sinai. American blood and treasure liberated Iraq from a despot. The hope was that Iraq would become the first true Arab democracy, with tolerance prevailing among its 3 major ethno-religious groups, the Kurds, the Shia, the Sunni. But in the wake of the American withdrawal, the jihadist group, known as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, which includes Syria and Lebanon as well, has regrouped and resurged in the Sunni areas. The Shia-dominated government is more dependent than ever on Iran. Iraqi Kurdistan is increasingly autonomous and self-sufficient and more friendly to America and Americans than any territory in the so-called Muslim world. For 35 years, Iran's revolutionary leaders have called themselves enemies of America. Hassan Rouhani, Iran's current president, is constantly referred to as a moderate. But in 1995, he said, "The beautiful cry of death to America unites our nation." Well, look, maybe he's mellowed since then. You think so? Last year, he added, "Saying death to America is easy. We need to express death to America with action." And yet there are those who think that an Iranian-American détente is just around the corner, achievable with just a few more meetings in Vienna. It's sometimes said that nations have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. That may not always hold true. I'm not convinced that it does. And even if it does, some nations' permanent interests permanently align. I would argue that those committed to the survival and success of liberty, as John Kennedy said, are our friends for the long haul. And those intent on the destruction of liberty and our destruction are not. It really is as simple and as complex as that. Others may disagree with me. Good, that's what we're here for. I want to take a moment to greet and acknowledge our distinguished audience. Everyone invited here is from the foreign policy community and the national security community writ large. It's not a public event. We're privileged to have with us today diplomats from 36 different countries, including 10 ambassadors, more than 60 officials RSVP'd from the Departments of State, Treasury, Defense, and Homeland Security, the FBI, and the White House. We have 80-plus members of the press registered at the conference, both domestic and foreign. And, of course, FDD's valued friends and supporters, without whom none of our work would be possible. Finally, please join me in expressing our collective gratitude to the members of the armed forces who are with us today. We're all grateful for your service and the important role you play. In designing the agenda for the Washington Forum, we were mindful to include speakers with a range of viewpoints and backgrounds. The conference provides a rare opportunity for experts from both sides of the aisle to engage in a spirited conversation about pressing national security and international security issues. So on behalf of FDD, the entire team, of which I am very proud, I want to wish you a stimulating, edifying, and enjoyable conference. Thank you. I'd like now to invite Andy Lappin to the stage to introduce our first session, which I'm going to moderate, America and the World 13 Years After 9/11.
Thanks, Cliff. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andy Lappin. I am a proud investor of FDD from Chicago, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion entitled America, the World, 13 Years After 9/11. The world looked very different in the spring of 2001. It was widely believed that with the Cold War over, America and the West had no serious enemies, and that the spread of freedom and liberal democracy was inevitable. Whatever conflicts remained would surely be resolved through diligent diplomacy. The Middle East appeared stable. Hosni Mubarak had been ruling Egypt for 20 years, Saddam Hussein had been ruling Iraq for 22 years, and Gaddafi had been doing the same in Libya for 32 years. 13 years ago, Iran's nuclear program was not seen as a priority concern by most Western leaders. Bashar al-Assad had replaced his father as president of Syria for just a year and was wrongly hailed as a reformist. Very few people knew who Osama bin Laden was, much less the threat he posed, or could imagine the atrocity that he would soon commit. Such words as jihad and caliphate were unknown to most Americans. Today we live in a fast-changing and highly uncertain world. The death toll in Syria's war has probably exceeded 150,000. The so-called peace process has hit another entirely predictable dead end. Vladimir Putin has begun redrawing borders in Eurasia. Iran is close to becoming nuclear weapons capable, posing an existential threat to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and perhaps others in the region. Are the negotiations making progress, or will the Iranians pretend to give up their nuclear ambitions, and will we in the West pretend to believe them? To debate these and other issues, we are joined now by three of America's most distinguished commentators on policy and politics. Robert Kagan is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in Foreign Policy at Brookings Institute. His most recent book is the New York Times bestseller, The World America Made. Dr. Kagan also serves as a member of Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. He writes a monthly column on world affairs for the Washington Post and is a contributing editor at the New Republic. Walter Russell Mead is the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College and editor-at-large of the American Interest. Until 2011, he was also a Brady Johnson Distinguished Fellow in Grand Strategy at Yale University. Previously, Mr. Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. Leon Wieseltier, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, thank you, has served as the literary editor of the New Republic since 1983. His influential essays span a broad range of topics, including culture, politics, and religion. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including the most recently, the Dan David Prize. Our moderator is Clifford May, president of Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'll second that. He has had a long, distinguished career in international relations, journalism, communications, and politics. He has covered, excuse me, my notes here have stuck, stories in more than 24 countries. He's the weekly foreign desk columnist for Washington Times and a frequent guest analyst on radio and television programs. Cliff, I'd like to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks, everyone. Let me start with Leon. Let me start with you. I think your most recent piece in the New Republic was, how should I say, a fairly devastating analysis, maybe even takedown of this administration's view of the world and strategy for dealing with it. Could you share with the audience a little bit about the thesis you outlined in this piece?
Oh, okay. Well, I cursed Obama for a variety of reasons. I think that there are a number of things that are happening and not happening in American foreign policy right now. I think that the president, first of all, is trying to portray the alternatives in almost every region in the world as either his way or war. They really believe this. And the vast range of instruments that are available to the United States that consist in more action than doing nothing or sending meals ready to eat, and less action than, as they say, boots on the ground, this vast range of instruments is being ignored. And it's being ignored for a variety of reasons. One is because every single aspect of Obama's foreign policy, as far as I can tell, is spooked by Iraq. That basically all he's determined to do is not start the Iraq war again and not start the Afghanistan war again, as if anybody is calling for anything remotely like this in any of the crises in which he's facing. So a whole series of phony dichotomies are being used to justify what is, I don't want to call it isolationism, I call it withdrawalism. But there is some sense about Obama, I feel, that he's pulling us out. He's pulling us out on the assumption, A, that if he didn't, our standing in the world would plummet the way it did after Bush. But of course, our standing in the world has plummeted for wholly new grounds that have to do with Obama's foreign policy or foreign non-policy. You know, the United States is distinctly unpopular in a variety of places, not because we take action, but because we don't take action. It turns out that a lot of places in the world that are undergoing turbulence, are under threat, are attempting to democratize or politically liberalize themselves, actually do look to the United States for serious, significant forms of support. And when we don't deliver, which we don't, I mean, you know, Obama has the number, if you made the list of the number of countries that are jittery about the United States or that require reassurance. I don't know if you read about, you know, if you look at the reports of our foreign policy in the papers, you'll discover that generally our foreign policy now consists in reassuring everybody about everything because nobody quite believes it. So he goes to Asia to reassure people, and he's got to reassure the Saudis, and he's going to Warsaw because he's got to reassure Poland and Eastern Europe. Everybody needs to be reassured, and quite rightly, they do need to be reassured, though I don't know how much his reassurances are going to be worth. But there is some sense in which Obama no longer believes that the preeminence of the United States in the world is, on balance, a good thing for the world. Now, it has had mixed results, though in life, as in foreign policy, I regard mixed results as very good. I mean, I have no trouble with mixed results, generally. His basic attitude, I think, is that our salience in the world is bad for the world, causes the world too much trouble. There are ethical problems, there are legal problems about it, and basically there is a new kind of introversion that he represents that I find deeply disturbing as a matter of historical principle, but also when you look around the world, it makes me worried because, you know, the world is, the corks are popping everywhere, everywhere. It's an extraordinarily, how shall I put it ironically, it's a rich time. And in this period of transition and crisis in which first principles of states and societies are at stake, the United States is essentially absenting itself in some deep way, and this is not in keeping with our values, with our interests, with our history, or with what I believe many societies in many places of the world actually want from us. They don't want the 82nd Airborne, but nobody's talking about the 82nd Airborne. I mean, the thing about the war in Iraq, whatever you think about it, is that it's not exactly representative of American foreign policy. It was distinguished in its field, right? But well, et cetera, et cetera. This is the sort of thing that I wrote, maybe a little bit more heatedly. Yeah.
Professor Mead, there's sort of a little controversy. Leon says that the president seems to have been spooked by Iraq. Do you think he's been spooked by Iraq, or does he have a world view, perhaps that goes back much longer than Iraq, that informs the kinds of policy decisions he's making? And if so, what is that? Well, let me get to the heart of that. Is that worldview one in which American power is probably a force that does more harm than good, and therefore it should be used very, very carefully and very, very sparingly?
Well, I've never been a big believer in the secret Kenyan Muslim socialist.
I don't know that I was necessarily
analysis
suggesting
of
that.
Obama, but, you know, I mean, I think if there's a figure, in some ways, I would compare President Obama to, it might be a sort of McGeorge Bundy, but with a different geopolitical founding. I think, like Bundy, the president is a technocratic, centralizing liberal who believes that that the right technique can solve all kinds of national and international problems. Unlike Bundy, though, President Obama believes in a view of the world that you'll hear some people who call themselves realists advocating, and that you hear on the right as well as on the left, which is that there is a spontaneous, benign balance of power that would assert itself if the United States lowered its profile in various regions. So that if there were less presence in the American presence in the Middle East, the different actors, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and so on, no one of them being strong enough to overturn all the others, some kind of a balance that we could live with would emerge. And that international institutions operating under principles of law and so on could regulate that balance of power with a much, much lighter touch from the United States. So, you know, as an idea, this is, I would say, it's neither anti-American nor out of the mainstream of American thinking in both liberal and conservative camps. I think it's wrong, and I think we've tried it before. I think it's a very good description of American foreign policy in the 1920s and 30s, where we said, without the U.S. playing a large role in Asia and Europe, a balance of power in, France and England are plenty strong enough to stop Germany from any kind of war of revenge or anything like that. And so Americans said, you know what, we don't need to deal with it. Now here I think the president is probably far more in tune with the thinking of a lot of average Americans than a lot of the foreign policy elite is, or than a lot of people perhaps in this room are. And I think it's, this is something we have to recognize, that what we're getting now is close to the foreign policy that if we were doing these things by referendum we might come up with. And the only problem with this foreign policy approach is that it doesn't work. Other than that, it's terrific. And, and historically, the American people have not actually, we are not among the world's great strategists as a population. Generally in the United States, what has to happen is somebody has to come along and hit us over the head with a 2x4, as Emperor Hirohito did in 1941. And that gets our attention, or for that matter, Osama bin Laden did in 2001. That gets our attention, we respond. And I'm afraid that what we are now in a pre-2x4 period yet again. We've gone from the post-2x4 period after 9/11 to a pre-2x4 period now. It's not great, but I think it would, speaking realistically, I'm not sure that President Obama could carry a lot of the American people with him on a dramatically different course right now. It's a tough moment.
Bob, feel free to comment on any of this, but let me start with this question. Foreign policy by referendum, it seems to me, presupposes a lack of leadership. Isn't the whole point of leadership to say, I know what you think, I know what you want, I know what you don't want, here's why I'm going to explain to you what we have to do and why it's in our interest and why I'm going to call on you to make the sacrifices to get this done?
I mean, yes. I mean, in this respect, and I unfortunately am all too much in agreement with Walter's analogy with the 20s and 30s, because I do think that's kind of where the mentality of the American people is right now. And in that respect, he's Harding, not Roosevelt post-1937, when the country was still in a very isolationist mood, and Roosevelt was actually becoming quite alarmed at what was going on in the world and began giving speeches. And by the way, I don't want to make Roosevelt into a titan. He would make a speech, he would get yelled at, then he would shut up for 6 months. But he
signed a neutrality
and well, that was right, and signed a neutrality war and give a speech in 1936, was election year, saying I hate war, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, he did push, and then events came along. But even he was not able to get Americans to respond to anything, including Hitler rampaging across Europe and conquering every country and putting Britain on its heels. That was not enough. And so, unfortunately, the 2x4, the American people had, in the past at least, have had an extremely high tolerance for the world completely collapsing. And in fact, the American response in the 1930s to the world collapsing was, it was all the more reason they didn't want to get involved. They didn't look at it and say, oh my God, we better do something. They said, oh my God, let's stay away from this. But I do want to respond to, something Leon said, because I disagree slightly on one point. Ultimately, I'm afraid this is about military power. And if you ask what it is fundamentally, set aside all the soft power and alleged American attractiveness and what have you, the world order that was established after World War II was a world order based essentially as its major foundation on military power. And if you ask other countries around the world what they're jittery about, actually it is, will we send the 82nd Airborne? If you ask why people in Singapore worried that when Obama didn't hit Syria, it's because they wonder, what does that mean if you have to use force against China. If you ask Japan today why they're nervous about the American response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's because they worry whether we will be willing to use force. The entire world order is based on presumptions about America's willingness to use force. And the problem with the American public right now, which is reflected in Obama's policies, is they have a complete aversion to the use of force, which not only, it turns out, prevents you from using force, it prevents you from doing things short of force, because they can see the slippery slope. So why don't they want to really be tough short of force on Ukraine? Because they can see, and they're not wrong. At the end of the day, if you start sanctioning and you lose, you're immediately confronted with the choice. Do we use force or do we back away? Force is critical. And the answer to Iraq is, I'm sorry, that was an unfortunate and lousy war. It doesn't change the basic realities of the international system. And if you want to go back to the 30s, everybody has a rationale for why they're doing what they're doing. But in the 30s, it started with, we don't want to have another war. Therefore, the Kellogg-Briand Pact is a wonderful solution, and the Washington Conference system is fabulous, and we have other means. And today, we also have millions of means, and if you're Frank Fukuyama, you don't have to do anything because everything's turning out wonderfully anyway. If you're Fareed Zakaria, it's all over, which is another reason not to do anything. So, but the bottom line is you don't have to do anything, and that's what drives everything else. And frankly, I don't think Obama has a doctrine, a half a doctrine. He has whatever Ben Rhodes wrote for him that day to explain whatever he just did. The doctrine is to avoid using force. And everything else is driven by that.
Let me stay with you for a moment and go, then I'll go to you. Let me go macro to micro for a second and have you answer this. Did we lose the war in Iraq, and are we about to lose the war in Afghanistan? And were they different wars, or are they part of the same war?
Okay.
30 seconds, please.
We didn't lose the war in Iraq until Obama pulled all of our troops out. Actually, Iraq was in reasonably decent shape. It would have meant, yes, we were going to have to keep troops in Iraq for many, many years. By the way, we've done that in our past. There's a lot of troops all over the world that have been there longer than we expected to, including troops in Europe, for that matter. And so, yes, we would have had to maintain a presence in Iraq. If we maintain a presence in Afghanistan, we won't have lost there either. Obama ensured that we lost in Iraq because he had a political interest in doing so, in a way, I think. And it's all part of his grand strategy of keeping us out of wars, to make sure that we clearly lost the last one. And I don't even know whether, maybe that was unconscious, but in any case, it was the consequence, because you could have said right now that despite everything, Iraq was a marginal success. Saddam Hussein is gone. Do we wish Saddam were still here? With Iran, with Assad, what a wonderful trio that would have made. And we could have said this was a moderate success, but they've turned it into an approaching failure.
Leon, do you want to comment? Do you want me to ask you a question? Which way would you rather
whatever
go?
you want, whatever you want. I mean, I just want to say,
Go ahead.
obviously, I agree with what Bob is saying, and I think that part of the problem is at the White House, but some of it is, it's not, is at the Pentagon. And the Pentagon, I'm referring not just to the slashing of our military capabilities, which is insane, but also to the fact that most Americans have been persuaded that the reason we are doing this is because of money, when in fact what exists at the Pentagon is a new strategic concept. The idea that there will be no more land wars, we will never have to use armies the way they were. It's part of the other mood in the Obama era, in the Obama administration, which is this futuristic, in the 21st century, everything will be different. And we can now leave all that stuff behind. And one of the things that keeps coming back to bite Obama is the 20th century. And he's undergoing this constant and very reluctant education, which isn't sticking in the continuities of modern history, and that there are certain features of the international system, certain interests, and certain instruments that are available to great powers that that are constant in some sense. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like that. Everything is different now. But of course, what we're learning is that everything is not different now.
Well, in fairness, he inherited. Sorry, please.
Yes. No.
He inherited the no boots on the ground approach, the futuristic approach from Don Rumsfeld.
From Rumsfeld, absolutely.
What Leon talks about, it does seem to be a theme of the Obama administration. You had John Kerry saying to Putin, this is the 21st century, you can't act like a 19th century man. You had President Obama in Brussels a month ago speaking to the youth, saying that until very recently, we thought with the advent of the 21st century, there would be this respect for the rule of law, no one would cross borders, all these it's an odd idea that the turn of a page on a calendar should bring in a world order without any need for it to be enforced by any power, unless you, I guess, believe that there is an international community and a United Nations and a Human Rights Watch that will do all this, and the President of the United States does not have to.
Of course, what he doesn't understand is that even multilateralism requires American leadership. In other words, he has this idea that the models are the United States either goes it tragically or stupidly alone and does these irresponsible things, or the world community together, of which we are just one among equals, will somehow spontaneously get it right and take action, when in fact multilateralism is a form of American leadership. We saw this in the first Gulf War, but we see it all the time. We see it all the time. It's what's missing now or we may see it, I suspect that we won't, in the question of whether Obama waits or does not wait for the Europeans on allegedly getting tougher with Putin, if that's what he wants. I mean, I see no evidence that he wants to. But, and we heard this during Bosnia. I remember during the Bosnia crisis, I would have debates with liberal friends who would say, it's a European problem. They've got to solve it. And I would say, why don't you just be more candid and say you can live with the genocide? Because you know that the Europeans are not going to solve it. And saying it's a European problem that they should solve it is actually is a fake formula for saying that you're content for this situation to persist because you think the United States should not act against it.
I just want to, again, circle back to this question of public opinion and the limits within which any president, and I think this president is not fighting it particularly, but the single worst thing probably the United States did in foreign policy, the most disastrous thing, was an act of omission. If President Theodore Roosevelt had been able to say to the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, the United States will not permit a revision of the balance of power in Europe, and if you launch an attack, the United States will ensure that you lose. And if the Kaiser, looking at American public opinion behind the president, had realized this was correct, there would have been no World War I, there would be no communism in Europe, no fascism. The entire disastrous course of 20th century history would have gone a very different way. But it was as impossible for Theodore Roosevelt to deliver that message to Kaiser Wilhelm as it would have been for him to fly to the moon, because it wasn't true. The American people were not in that frame of mind. And President Roosevelt, who was certainly not shy about American power and certainly not unconcerned with European great power politics, knew that very well. So in that sense, I think we need to return to the very, very critical role, not simply of the president as an isolated figure, but of the people whose job it is to inform the American people, to engage with the American people, to help them understand what's going on out there and why their interests are linked to that, why it's necessary that we do certain things. And here again, in one sense, the willingness of the American people to support an active foreign policy is a very good measure for their trust in the establishment. That is because those are the people who are telling them these things. Right now, whatever one thinks of the Bush administration or the Iraq war, any of those things, there's not a lot of faith in the public at large that the people who got us into the Iraq war knew what they were doing. There is not a lot of faith in the American people that the business leadership who tell us about free trade and all of these things and yet didn't really say a lot about the impending housing bubble and so on and so forth, that they really, do these people really, are we so sure they know what they're talking about that we want to take the risks they want us to take? Do we really need to believe them?
But the interesting question now is, one has to put a little pressure on this idea that it's legitimate for the commander-in-chief to just be an exercise in followership.
But
In
again,
other
I'm
words-
just saying he can't. This is,
Well-
you know, you know, would the Democratic Party's intellectuals support the president if he did that? By and large, no. I am not trying to, you know, I think he could do more than he is doing. But I am saying that we ought to be thinking much harder about where people like us have not done as well as we have done and haven't done as much. I would accept Bob Kagan, who I think is doing a very good job. But
It's changing everything.
Everything, yeah.
you know, really,
Yeah, I was gonna
think
say-
how bad it
But
would
thank
be
you.
without him.
But thank
right?
you, Walter.
Okay.
No.
But
But look, let me
seriously,
just, let me,
One
let me,
more article and it's world peace.
let me just suggest a
I tell myself that every morning, and it helps me get going. Just one more.
I mean, having you know, gone along with the analogy with the 20s and 30s, let me just make a couple of ways in which this is not the 20s and 30s. Now, your counterfactual of Theodore Roosevelt going off in 1914 is way counterfactual. I mean, that was actually
1906, I was thinking.
whatever.
more when
That
he
was
president.
that was Britain's job to do. Britain failed to do it, and the key thing is that even after the United States abdicated the role it needed to take on after World War I, it would have been taking on the support of a world order that Americans had assumed was supposed to be taken care of by basically Britain.
right.
And what we didn't realize was that Britain was no longer capable of doing it. And so that was a kind of a move from not being responsible to being responsible for everything. That was harder. This is our world order. So I'm not saying
But most
I'm gonna give-
Americans may not know
I get it. They don't. That's our job. But this at least is our world order. We have to give it up. We now have to play the role of Britain in this situation and give it up. We're perfectly capable of doing it.
Yeah.
The other thing that's different, though, in the 1930s, the dominant force in Congress, overwhelming, in fact, with almost no opposition, were the so-called isolationists. Bora and company, they controlled Congress every step of the way, and the Democrats had headed for the hills. They never recovered from the defeat of Wilson in terms of foreign policy. So there was nothing pushing against the trend that was dominant in public opinion. Today, and by the way, the intellectual elite had totally given up. There was almost no internationalist that you could find that anybody was paying attention to. It is a little different now. Congress is not dominated by isolationists or whatever you want to call them. Rand Paul speaks to a very important strain in the American public, which I think agrees with him much more than we want to admit, but Congress is not dominated by Rand Paul. Which means that the job of Obama's task now, is not nearly as difficult as Roosevelt's task was in the 1930s. There are people that Obama could be working with on the Hill who would join him on both sides of the aisle, who would join him in saying, we've all got to do this. And that may not last forever, by the way. And it's a moment that needs to be seized. But that is why I would say his task is not as impossible as it might have been in the 1930s.
That's a fair point, but I would also say that we've never succeeded in the United States really of kind of explaining to people why we are the new Britain and why that's important.
That's because communism made it unnecessary,
that's
and then
exactly
9/11
right.
made it unnecessary,
Well, not only
and we've never had to do it.
unnecessary,
Right.
but there was that key meeting, with Truman and all, so trying to figure out what to do.
Right.
And he doesn't get any buy-in from the congressional leadership
Until it's
he
about the
talks about
communists.
communism.
Right.
And so it was too hard
Right.
to actually do it in 1947, 48. And we relied on communism. Then it was terror.
Exactly.
And now, in a sense,
There's nothing left.
Right. So we've got to actually make the argument
Right, which we've
that for
never
two
made.
generations we've avoided at a time when establishment credibility is not high.
I totally agree.
And that's the difficulty. And I think we need to think about that.
Leon, is Islamism, which I'm going to define as the imperative of Muslim domination, as coherent an ideology and as a serious a threat to the West as were communism and fascism in its various
Well, it's
forms?
not a philosophical threat, obviously. Communism was probably never a serious philosophical threat, except that communism spoke a Western vocabulary, but used the vocabulary of the Enlightenment. One of the reasons people were so confused about communism for so long is because liberalism and communism shared too many words, and it took decades until it became clear what they meant by the words and what we mean by the words. And so there was never the case with fascism. There was never a threat that that Hitler's and Mussolini's view of the world was going to be adopted by many Americans. And no, so it's not an ideological threat. It is a threat. It is a political threat. Well, it is a security threat in some ways. In some ways, Al-Qaeda is alive and well in a variety of places, just not in Waziristan anymore, but that's not interesting. If you're a security planner, you've got to go where the threat is. It's empirical. And there was that moment, when was it, 2 or 3 months ago, when Clapper testified, and you felt that for 20 seconds there was some hope, or at least people were paying attention to Syria, when he described Syria as potentially he talked about it in counterterrorism terms, because of that it might become actually jihadist, Islamist central in some way. But Islamism is a threat in various states and societies that should matter to the United States, and that we say do matter to the United States. So yes, I think that what's happened, the so-called Arab Spring. I mean, it's democratization, if that's what's happening. But at least these upheaval, it's not clear. It's not clear that it's not, by the way.
Yeah.
It's not clear that it's not. But this is not a democratization, or call it what you want, is not an event. It's an era. It's an era. It's not something that overnight happens and a society suddenly gets it all right. I mean, it took the West centuries to get it right. And even after we got it right, both fascism and communism were developed as allergic recoils from our version of modernity, liberal, secular modernity, with untold catastrophic consequences. So this is an era, and we have to keep our heads during this era. And not, there are people who say, well, if they would have democratized already, if they were going to be a democracy, they would be one already, so it failed. Or because there are these violent responses to the prospect of liberalization, that means they don't really want it, et cetera, et cetera. This is an era in the history of the Arab world, and different countries are going to play it out a little bit differently. And as I say, we've got to keep our heads. We've got to keep our heads, and we have to know, which the Obama administration does not know, what our values are and what our long-term interests are. And it's very important. I mean, the Obama administration, certainly in the Middle East, has performed what is a kind of miraculous feat. It's managed to alienate absolutely everybody. It's absolutely extraordinary. It used to be that if you alienated the Saudis, you had the Israelis, or that if you alienated, these people, you have. There is nobody in that region who trusts him. Nobody.
Well, the Iranians are wondering whether they
Oh,
can.
but the Iranians, we can talk about that. I mean,
Well, I
Geneva
do want to
is-
talk about that. I'm going to ask a couple more questions here, and then we're going to go to audience questions. You'll raise your hand, and I'll get to you, and then we'll bring a mic over to you. And please, if you can identify yourself as well, Professor, I'm going to ask this same question in a different way, which is to say that the idea of communism was to appeal to a class, to the proletariat, and say, join with us and we can rule. The idea of Nazism was to appeal to a race and say, we Aryans can rule. The idea of Islamism is to appeal to members of a religion and say, we Muslims, we can rule. Am I wrong to see it in those terms?
No, I think, look, Islam, like Christianity, like Hinduism, there are a lot of Islams in there. And I think it's important not to sort of essentialize, a complex religious phenomenon.
But let me just be very clear that I don't mean to do that. What I'm saying is that the Islamists, who I think are people who believe in an ideology derived from a religion, are appealing to the world's Muslims and those who might, and saying you have a right to rule, as you did for 1,000 years, which you understand as a historian better than most.
I think they've got, like communism and like fascism, Islamism as an ideology has a mix of strengths and weaknesses. One of its strengths is that it is at least potentially trans-ethnic, trans-civilizational in some way. You can join the club very easily.
Right.
If you weren't Aryan, you couldn't join Hitler's club. Right. But they can do that. On the other hand, Islamism, like a lot of other sort of isms, is a much better protest and organizing ideology than a ruling ideology. Lenin and Stalin really had to reinvent the sort of philosophical and political agitation of Marxist protest to create a new kind of state that was then able to sort of rely on the rhetoric and all and the associations of this, but create real power. I haven't seen yet in the Islamist camp the emergence of, yes, sort of terrorists, yes, organizations, but somebody who's able to build and maintain a very powerful state based on this ideology. That we don't see yet.
So let me ask Bob a question. I want to get this on the table before we go to the questions, and it builds off what we just heard. There is one Islamist, indeed, I would say jihadist state, that is Iran. It is the leading sponsor of terrorism in the world. It is viciously oppressive domestically. And you tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to be getting closer to having a nuclear weapons capability, despite, and maybe in some ways because of the negotiations that are taking place. Maybe you have faith in them, you'll tell us. But what is it, I guess, but the question is it a hinge moment if this jihadist state with oil wealth sponsoring terrorism is allowed to get a nuclear weapons capability by the United States and the West?
Well, it's a hinge moment regionally. It's not a hinge moment globally. It will be a terrible setback with all kinds of consequences for the region, which will drag the United States in, and we'll face a much more difficult problem. Unfortunately, in the era we live in, it is not either the only problem or possibly even the biggest problem. And the way, my framework for looking at things is, can we sustain basically the liberal world order that we have sustained since World War II? And if you ask me what makes it harder or impossible to sustain that world order, it is things like China becoming the dominant hegemon of East Asia. It is things like that plus Russia reestablishing the Soviet Union. In that regard, if you add Iran to that pot, that is all part of the world order breaking down. If it's just Iran, that is going to be a terrible problem for us, but it is not a world order threatening problem. And just in the interest of, if I could just respond to the other point that you said, and then I'll shut up. It would be a mistake, if you look at this from this world order perspective, it would be a mistake to say that our foreign policy needs to be directed at Islamism, okay? Our foreign policy needs to be directed at ensuring that Islamism doesn't destroy the world order. And that may require different tactics in different situations. We made many mistakes that actually undermined our world order in the fight against communism. We supported dictatorships who ultimately proved in a way more damaging than what we were afraid of. And it was only in the 80s that we got out of that and started undermining these dictatorships and promoting democracy. If you ask me today, what was a bigger threat, and this may not be a popular statement here, Morsi's government or the present Egyptian military dictatorship to our world order, it is the present military dictatorship. Because this is going to lead to a much more radical revolution in Egypt that is going to hurt us more than letting the Morsi government fail as it was going to do and lose the next election. I told you that was not going to be a popular statement, but that's what I believe. I think we are being dragged down into a death spiral by this Egyptian military government. It's not going to serve our interest.
Let's start with questions. Gary Bauer is right there. Stand up and bring a microphone over to Gary. Thank you.
Hi, Gary Bauer. Great discussion. To the extent that there's been a change in public opinion about the willingness to use force abroad or to be more involved abroad, hasn't that change essentially been on the right among people that were part of the Reagan coalition? And isn't at least part of that explained by the fact that they don't want to follow this commander-in-chief to war? I mean, if he's lost 2 wars we had almost won, why would anybody want to sacrifice another American soldier to see him lose the war that he starts? So I don't think the isolationist problem is as bad as we think. I think we got a commander-in-chief problem.
No.
Go ahead, Leon.
I think that, I don't live thickly among Republicans, and there may be some empirical truth to what you're saying, but I think that the isolationist currents that are now in the Republican Party go very deep, and that they're philosophical and ideological. and that their roots long precede Obama, and that there is, I think if you think that the problem is only that they don't trust Obama, then I think you're underestimating the ideological civil war that needs to be fought inside the Republican Party, because the Republican foreign policy consensus that once existed, which I actually supported, though I'm not a Republican, has shattered. And for a whole variety of reasons, public opinion, politicians, libertarian ideologies, all kinds. But I think that the first sacred opportunity of Republicans who care about America's place in the world is to get serious about the philosophical challenge that has been made to American internationalism within the Republican Party, and not to, it's Obama's, you can blame him for lots of things, but what you must not do is reproduce in opposition the cult of the personality that now takes place at the White House. In other words, there are factors that are actually larger than Obama, historical factors, and the Republican Party's turn away from internationalism. Not all of it, obviously, because, I mean, McCain and other people are on fire, but I think that there is a primary battle of ideas that needs to be waged within the Republican Party over the kind of thing that Bob was talking about. And I would not personalize it or politicize it and make it, or try to, or lay it at Obama's door, because that would underestimate the challenge.
Go ahead if you wanted to
Yeah,
comment on
just
that.
very quickly, Gary. I agree essentially with Leon, but I would say, for example, on the debate over Syrian intervention, the fact that the signals, well, it's going to be really big and change things, it's going to be a little tiny thing. What were people being asked to support? So I think there is a kind of an extra thing that there are people who in principle might be open to persuasion by someone they trusted. They don't trust this guy. And because a lot of those people I've written about, talking about the Jacksonian trend in American life, because they're often the heart and soul of support in popular support for a vigorous American action abroad that may involve the use of force. When those people drop out of the coalition, the pro-war coalition suddenly can look very, very thin on the ground. So it's not irrelevant what you're saying.
Let's go over there, and please identify yourself. Keep your questions, everybody, short, because we have a lot of them, and I want to take a lot of questions right there. Yeah. Please.
Thank you very much, Cliff. This is Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan American League. I agree with Mr. Kagan that inaction is always better than action is not a policy. And always in the recorded history of mankind, the decisive argument has always been the argument of power. My question is that since the world is going through transformation from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, what do you foresee in the future? What would be the placement of USA in the multipolar world? What kind of leverage, positioning, and power they will have in a multipolar world? Thank you.
Well, I actually have argued against and still don't believe we're in a multipolar world or necessarily heading toward a multipolar world. It's really up to the United States to decide whether we're going to go in that direction or not. The United States still occupies a unique position in the international system, partly, if only for reasons of geography, but also combined wealth and military power. The day we get to a multipolar world is the day that we enter a very dangerous situation, because multipolarity, despite what some international relations theorists think, is actually a very unstable international situation where you have constant competition, constant miscalculation. The reason we've enjoyed such stability over these many years is because we've been living in a, well, I think what we're living in is what Huntington called a uni-multipolar world. So you've got one on the top, and then you have multiple powers underneath and in a second tier. And I think that's what we should sustain and what we need to sustain. We won't make a smooth transition from the unipolar world to the multipolar world. We will make a transition from the present world order probably to a world order that is just simply broken down. We'll go from where we are now to chaos. And this is part of the problem with a lot of these post-American world predictions, is that somehow the post-American world makes a nice, easy transition into a multipolar, maybe cooperative world in which the Chinese are just as helpful in upholding the world order as the United States was. And that's just a myth. What we will get is probably chaos. When the British world order broke down, it broke down into chaos. And that's what we have the best chance of seeing.
Let me just pick up on Dr. Nasser's question, Professor, and if memory serves, and it may not, so you'll give me a bad mark, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. Henry Kissinger essentially said there are two stable models. One is the hegemon, one nation sort of leads to everybody. And the other, you have a balance of power among what are essentially empires or spheres of influence. Everything else doesn't work, everything else falls back into one of those eventually. So this idea of a multipolar world, an international community, and international organizations, that's never been tested and maybe can't work at all. But if we do not exercise some hegemony, we're going to have Putin essentially reestablishing an empire or a sphere of influence, China doing that larger and larger in Asia, Iran doing that in the Middle East. And that could be the world that's shaping up, and probably it's not a stable world, am I right?
Yeah, I actually have a piece in the Current Foreign Affairs that talks about the return of geopolitics and making the point that a lot of what we have seen is just sort of, the advance of democracy, the advance of values, rests on the geopolitical settlement that came at the end of the Cold War, which very much was solidifying the American hegemony in Eurasia, not as some kind of, not an empire in a classic sense, and there's certainly room for other powers to pursue their interests, but it was a basic order. And you're seeing in a number of different ways, Russia, China, and Iran are not allies in a conventional sense, and they would ultimately be at one another's throats, and there are all kinds of tensions between them. But they share a strong common interest in overturning the post-Cold War order in Eurasia, and each in its own way and following its own interests has been trying to do that. China, oddly, which is the most powerful and potentially the most threatening of them, has had less success, in part because Japan is coming on more heavily. Iran, which is the weakest of the three in terms of its real great power potential, has had the most success, partly because the Middle East is such a mess. Russia is in the middle between the two, but Putin seems to have decided that his hour has struck, and that again, from Putin's point of view, there's a combination. Russia is basically on a long-term downhill path. It will be less able to reshape the world the way it would like 10 years from now or 20 years from now than it can now. And given the sort of a moment of American weakness and global instability, Putin has seen an opportunity and frankly has gone after it in a very, very smart way.
Let me just add to that. And the reason it's so important to understand that we don't have to lose any of this. It's actually fairly easy to sustain where we are.
Yes.
China faces a huge set of hurdles, which is they are surrounded by very powerful nations, all of whom are allied to the United States. Russia faces one of the richest continent in the world, backed by the United States. Iran, in theory, faces a lot of neighboring powers that fear it, backed by the United States. That is potentially a very stable situation. There's nothing inevitable about the emergence of these powers, but the common element of all of that is the United States. And the way you will get to multipolarity and all the dangers associated with that is by pulling back on the support that we give to these regional allies. Otherwise, it's easy to sustain.
Right. This is where the 1930s analogy, I think, is really quite strong. Britain and France there was absolutely no historical necessity in 1933, 1934 that things would go the way it would, either in Asia or in Europe. But poor policy thinking, drawing the wrong lessons out of World War I and a variety of other things, put them in a position where they were fighting for their lives. We are very much, I think, Bob, this is a point I think we all have to do a better job of getting across, that we are not calling for some kind of global mobilization, huge fight to the death. In fact, what we're looking for is the way, in a sense, the ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. Long term, the least expensive, least risky, least challenging form of foreign policy is to act on these issues while they're still relatively small. And this is the element, I think, that is badly missing from the discourse in the United States. That in fact, I think it's actually people like Bob and me, and probably include Leon here, who are the real minimalists right now. The course that we are advocating is the course that in the long run will cost far less in blood, toil, tears, and sweat, not to mention money, than any other course that's available. And this, I think, is where the national debate has gotten onto a kind of a false pretense of thoughtful, moderate realists like Neville Chamberlain and Stanley Baldwin versus like crazy warmongers like Winston Churchill. It's a mess.
Very, very quick question for you, Bob. You know a lot about NATO, and if Putin decides he's going to protect the Russian population of Estonia or Latvia, both NATO members, does NATO successfully defend them?
At the moment, I don't know that we have the immediate capacity to respond. I mean, I would say that what Putin has done in Ukraine before sending troops, I don't know that NATO currently has a response to that in those countries. I know that I believe that at least on the American side, and probably as part of the NATO planning unit, they are scrambling to make sure that they can, and that's why we send 150 troops.
Better be good troops. That 150.
But look, can I just? I mean, I know you wanted a quick answer to that, but we could have forestalled a lot of what was happening in Ukraine. We have complete air superiority in this area. We have the capacity to send forces into Kiev. We've chosen not to do that. So I think that at the end of the day, we could ultimately defend these people. But I would like to get to the point where he doesn't think he has any opportunity, so that we're not put in that position.
Two questions back there. We're going to do Peter Yusey and Hillel Fracken, and then let's come down here. We've got a bunch of people in this front area want to ask
Peter
questions.
Husey from the Air Force Association. Let me talk about not the fight within the Republican Party, but Democrats who have no place to go. Talked to 3 Democratic senators on armed services, Begich, Donnelly, and Warner. I asked them all the same question. Given what's going on in Ukraine and Crimea, should we keep sequestration, minimize our nuclear deterrent spending, and don't do anything more on missile defense? And as Senator Donnelly said in Indiana at a conference I was hosting, he said, who the heck believes that? And I said, the Arms Control Association. Oh, nobody believes them. But they all said, do missile defense, get rid of sequestration, modernize our nuclear deterrent, and go and defend our NATO allies. Those 3 Democrats have no place to go within the party, as you gentlemen have rightly pointed out. How do we get them to join us?
Well, I don't think we're going to get them to join us, but there is and by the way, it's better to have them in the other party, in theory. I mean, look, we are where we are, unfortunately, for the next 2 years. We're going to have a new president after 2016. I cannot believe that even as I look at the prospective Democratic and Republican candidates, either one of them will be able to reach into Congress and find this, especially in the Senate, this bipartisan center, the people you named and everyone from McCain to Kelly Ayotte and Lindsey Graham, et cetera, and forge a consensus around those people. That is there for the taking. Why this administration doesn't want to engage in that? They have terrible congressional relations, period. I mean, it doesn't even matter which issue you pick. So that's not, but they also have no interest in forging this consensus.
Right.
So we're going to have to, it can't happen without presidential leadership is the answer. And I'm optimistic that we will get better presidential leadership out of the next president on this kind of issue.
Let's go to Hillel, and then we're going to come up here for a few questions.
Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute, and thanks very much for that. It was a wonderful discussion. Bob said just a little while ago that the guiding star, so to speak, should be not so much what we're against, although it will entail that, but what we're for, and the object really is the liberal global order. What I'm wondering is, taking into account what Walter said about the complications of American public opinion, and what Leona said about the internal fights in various parties, how is that to be framed, that object, for public support? It is, as I think, partially true that what Walter said before, that we respond to the 2x4, and the 2x4s usually come with specific names attached to them or arms attached to them. So I'm just wondering how you conceive of promoting that, which I agree with. I think that is the way one should look at it strategically, but how is it operable?
Are we taking another one? Or?
No, go ahead, unless you want to, but if you're going to respond to that, then I'll take another question, Senator.
You know, I don't know how far we've fallen in terms of, you know, how much harder it's gotten to do that than before. But if you look at let's start by looking at the post-Cold War period. You know, I think that public opinion was not enthusiastic about any of the interventions that the United States conducted from 1989 to 2003. I mean, in a way, the Iraq War was the most popular war that there was. Every single other conflict, every other use of force did not have majority support before the president took action. And yet, for, you know, the better part of 15 years anyway, presidents were able to take repeated military actions. I mean, the United States was highly interventionist in that period. From George Bush invading Panama in 1989 to Somalia, you know, Bosnia, Kosovo, what have you. There were lots of interventions, a very high pace actually, with very kind of tepid, lukewarm support. And it seems to me that we could have continued along that path with presidential leadership saying, you elected me to make this decision, I'm making this decision. By the way, most presidents, after they used force, their popularity went up most of the time, including Bill Clinton. So I think now we may have fallen too far to be able to get back to that situation again, in which case we are back to this fundamental problem that Walter identified, which is how do you explain something that is not obvious? It requires a certain imagination. If this happens, then this happens. And it's also not simply a question of national interest narrowly defined. When you're talking about supporting a liberal world order, it transcends narrow national interest, and that is a hard case to make. But again, all you can do is say, it's for the politicians who believe it to make it, it's for the intellectuals who believe it to make it. And by the way, our intellectual class has contributed to this. The dominant intellectual view has been America's in decline, or we're in a brand new world that doesn't require force. I mean, the American people have been told all kinds of crap for 2 decades now by our leading intellectuals about how the world works and about what's happening. So now I see a lot of those people are coming back and realizing, oh my God, we're about to lose everything. So maybe we'll get better leadership from the intellectual class. That would be nice.
Okay, I want to take a couple of questions, so let's ask them to be quick. Gerald, let me start with you.
Thank you, gentlemen. For Professor Kagan, you described the nuclear Iran as a regional hegemon, but wouldn't ICBM be a global disruptor? And is not the catbird seat of being a superpower control the Straits of Hormuz? And it would become a serious question whether we could call ourselves a superpower anymore if we do not have that catbird seat. And for the sublime mind of Dr. Wieseltier, I describe your paradigm as benign neglect and not so benign. But yet there was some kind of leadership with no follow-through plan in Libya. There was step in, step out in Syria, et cetera. So perhaps it's a textbook case of Psych 101 of the disorganized personality as the policies. That you can't, that you're all three right, and it's a disorganized personality.
No, I think that, look, I think Obama's been pretty consistent. I think the main purpose of our mission in Libya was for the mission in Libya to come to an end quickly. That was our objective in Libya, was to get out as quickly as we could. I think that we all know about the Syrian Red Lines, which is a very dark chapter that has been ramifying through the world. I mean, if there are dictators or hegemons on Mars, they saw what we didn't do. That was the global green light. That was the global green light. And in fact, it is a green light. Any ruler, any dictator who in the next 2 years would like to seize a piece of territory, shut down a TV station, imprison a dissident, they've been told that they will not be impeded by us, which is really a green light. So I think Obama's been very consistent. I think he prides himself, if you listen to him talk, his greatest achievement was in getting us out of Iraq and Afghanistan. The tide of war is receding. I mean, of course, not in the rest of the world, but the tide of the war is, that's actually what he thinks his place in history is. It's a very damaging conception of what the role of the commander-in-chief is. But he really genuinely believes it, and the people around him are, he hires people not to challenge his opinions, but to protect his decisions. And that's what they do, and I don't expect there's going to be any change. I think they're going to muddle through some, history will inconvenience him, as I wrote last week, every once in a while, and they will muddle through, and maybe we'll be pushed into, but sending those missiles to one unit in Syria that you read about the other day, big deal. Big. Huh? Well, it's a mixture of crisis management, which most foreign policy has become. It's a mixture of crisis management, ideological stubbornness, and it's a mixture of many things.
Let me get you to respond to Jaro's other question. I'll actually ask the two of you, which is that, as he points out, Iran will have ICBMs. They will be a nuclear tip. It does have Hezbollah, which is a proxy foreign legion. It's all over Latin America right now, not to mention in Lebanon. It will have the Straits of Hormuz, and it has a chance to dominate the Persian Gulf, which has about 56% of the world's known petroleum reserves, upon which Europe is reliant. I think Jaro's suggestion is that makes it more than a regional power.
Well, but that presumes that we have withdrawn from the region. I mean, they can have all this capability. And by the way, don't get me wrong, this is bad, all right? It's not the only thing going on, is the only point that I'm making. But we will have to respond if we fail to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which seems likely. We will have to respond with military countermeasures. We're going to have to increase our military presence in the region so that we don't lose the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, that would be an intolerable setback. We're facing China now. We haven't lost the South China Sea yet. You know what I mean? So what we're going to face is another great power with dangerous capabilities, which we are then going to have to step up and counter, both with our own missiles, with missile defense, with increased naval capacity. That's the world that's, in a way, that's the most likely set of outcomes. My concern is we won't understand that we have to do that, or we'll be unwilling to do that, in which case then Iran becomes what you're talking about.
I would add one final point here.
Yes.
I think we're running low on time, so I'll try to be fast. And that is that, if I were a moderate member of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, consulting with our supreme leader and guide, at this moment, I would say, take the Obama deal. You're basically being offered, take a 6 or maybe 4 month threshold between you and a nuclear capability and get an end to sanctions plus the Fertile Crescent. That is to say, the U.S. is not going to be opposing you in Syria or Lebanon or Iraq in any serious way. You get that, even if you're still a threshold state, nuclear state, you will gradually increase your power in the Gulf in ways that would then make it very, very difficult for the United States to respond when and if you do decide for your breakout.
But can I just
So I would say, in some ways at this point, the only thing I fear more than a failure of the negotiations in Geneva would be their success. It's not a good situation.
But there is one other element that needs to be kept in the discussion about Iran, and you're treated like a bit of a kook if you do, and that is democratization. I mean, the only stable long-term solution to this problem is a change of regime in Tehran. Now, it's true that the democracy clock clicks much more slowly than the nuclear clock. It's also true
Well, there is no clock.
There is no clock.
That's the other possibility.
Yeah, that's right. But one of the reasons there may not be a clock is because in 2009, when a clock began to tick, the United States and others just let it tick to death. And, it's, again, it's very important for us to understand that I think that's the only, in the long term, that's the only real solution.
I think what we are agreeing on is that 13 years after 9/11, we live in a very dangerous world. I want to thank our panelists. I think this is a fascinating discussion. Sorry we didn't have more time. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate this.